Amat merat ike tesolderat igmerut.
Hey all, Dave here. Before I begin, I just want to say thank you to Kind9 for suggesting the topic of this video. It's something I've thought about doing in the past, but your suggestion motivated me to do it, so cheers. As you can probably tell from the title, the topic of this video is book recommendations. I've put atheism in the title, but I'll also bring up a few bonus books just at the end. Basically anything that I think might help someone wanting to look more into atheism and maybe improve their critical thinking and skepticism a little bit, which is something that I think more atheists should be doing. I often see posts on places like Facebook and Twitter making claims like there are no arguments for atheism and there is nothing to atheism but not believing, which simply isn't true. There are lots of arguments for atheism, and there have been arguments since the Greek philosophers. Studying atheism and the arguments for atheism were a part of my undergrad philosophy degree. There is also more to atheism than simply not believing. There are several kinds of atheism, and atheism is defined in many ways. And before anyone jumps down my throat in my comment section arguing that I don't understand atheism, pause, take a breath. There is lots of bad information that floats around atheist circles and communities about atheism and skepticism and critical thinking. Much of it is accepted uncritically. Maybe, just maybe, reading some of these books might help understand that. Anyway, let's get on with the list. These are in no particular order, and their place on the list basically depends on my memory and their place on my bookshelf. So the first one up is a very short introduction to atheism. The very short introduction books are fantastic little books, and there are a lot of them. The series covers a wide range of topics. If there's something you want a quick and very basic rundown to, then these are great starting points. They're essentially the book equivalent of a Wikipedia article, although obviously with even more detail, and they can't be edited by just anyone. The very short introduction book on atheism is written by philosopher Julian Baggini, and it's a great book if you want to know the basics of atheism. It covers topics like what is atheism, the case for atheism, and the history for atheism, along with a few other topics, of course. One thing I can see putting lots of atheists off the book is that it covers atheism in the hard atheism sense. It defines atheism as the belief God does not exist, while many atheists today define it in the weak atheism sense, with some automatically dismissing anyone who defines atheism in the hard sense as not knowing anything about atheism. However, it is these people who need to read on the topic the most. Unfortunately, the book does not discuss atheism in the weak sense, even though atheism in the weak sense is popular. One of the reasons for this, I think, is that the book is written by a philosopher. And in philosophy, it's generally accepted that atheism is the belief that God does not exist. Also, the book was written in 2003, slightly before the rise in popularity of atheism and figures like Dawkins and Hitchens. Well, there were those that used atheist in the weak sense before this rise in popularity. It was more common to refer to atheism as being the strong sense. The book is also pretty short and pretty easy to digest. Definitely one to add to the read list if you want to look a little deeper into atheism and understand a little more about it. It's a perfect starting point. Like a very short introduction to atheism, this too is a pretty short book, as well as being a pretty easy read. This one is written by Graham Oppy, who is considered by many professional apologists to be the most formidable atheist thinker today, as well as being one of the leading experts in the philosophy of religion, which is where most of his books are aimed at, those interested in the philosophy of religion and those who have some experience in it, and with formal logic. However, this book is aimed at people simply wanting to learn more about atheism and agnosticism, both about how and why the terms are defined the way they are, as well as understanding the arguments for both. The book covers both positive and negative atheism, as well as strong and weak agnosticism, though it does lay out an argument for why atheism should be seen in the strong sense because of its grounding in the philosophy of religion. The arguments made in the book are not designed to conclusively prove that God does not exist or that being agnostic is the only rational stance. Instead, they're aimed at showing that there are good reasons to adopt either position, as well as promoting the idea that both positions can be rational. It's an excellent starting place for those wanting to strengthen their arguments against theism, or justify their belief that God does not exist, or their skepticism, and simply understanding that there is more to atheism and agnosticism than simply not believing and not claiming to know. The next book on the list follows the trend of the previous two in that it's aimed at those wanting to discover more about atheism, or to better understand what atheism is. Also, like the previous books, this book contains content that may put off many of today's atheists. It discusses atheism in the sense of hard atheism, but it does discuss non-belief in many different senses. Kerry Walker, the author, talks about the wide variety of reasons that someone may be an atheist or an agnostic, and the wide variety of non-belief that exists. This discussion on non-belief also includes discussion about the history of atheism and various popular writers who made contributions to the advancement of atheism and agnosticism. So not only does it work as an introduction to the history of non-belief, but also is a great resource for anyone who wants to dig deeper into the thoughts of atheists and agnostics through history, and the evolution of atheism and agnosticism through the ages. There is also a section on the atheist worldview, which may cause a few of today's atheists to dismiss the book. It's a popular claim that atheism isn't a worldview after all. This shouldn't put people off reading the book though, as the chapter discusses the topic in deeper detail, and anyone reading will no doubt learn something new about the atheist worldview and what the atheist worldview means. Other topics included in the book cover morality, the natural history of religion, and arguments for atheism, among lots of others. It's also a very easy read, though slightly larger than the previous two books on the list. This is a very different book to those previously mentioned. It's not written by a single author, and it does not cover atheism in the same way that the previous book did. Instead, this book is a collection of short writings from, yep, you guessed it, 50 different atheists. It includes writers like Graham Oppy, Stephen Law, James Randi, Miriam Namazi, Sean Carroll, J.L. Schellenberg, and many more. Some well-known writers and some less well-known. Also, another way this book differs from the previous is that this book doesn't have the same kind of focus that they did. It covers a wide range of topics like arguments for atheism and non-belief, people discussing their experiences with religion, the importance of skepticism, religious belief and disbelief, and more. Some of the writings are more complicated and denser than others and slightly less accessible. Most of it is pretty easy reading though, and all of it is very interesting. I definitely recommend this one for someone wanting to expand their knowledge of atheism, expand their knowledge of arguments for atheism, understand what makes some atheists tick, and that kind of thing. It's not a book I see many people speak about, but I do feel like it's one that atheists should read. If you watch my content or know me, you could probably guess that this one was coming. This one focuses on religion, belief, and skepticism about religion. It offers skeptical arguments against many of the arguments presented by Christians. As Christianity was the dominant religion of the time, that's where many of the arguments are focused, of course. Hume's book takes the form of dialogues between believers, and Hume explores the arguments for and against through the use of these dialogues. It covers the most popular arguments of the time, including teleological and cosmological arguments. One of the interesting things about the book is its use of believers as the main characters, each of them believing in the same God and the same ideas, but having different arguments and finding each other's arguments to be weak or incorrect, showing the kind of disunity that exists even among believers in the same God. Pretty interesting to read. The arguments for God are somewhat dated, with the book coming out in 1779 after all. However, many of them are still used today, especially by Christians on the ground, so to speak. By which I mean just the average believer. But some are also still used today by professional apologists. Though even in the cases where the arguments are outdated, Hume's responses to them are transferable to many of the arguments made today. Though even in the cases where the arguments are outdated, Hume's responses to them are transferable to many of the arguments. With this being a philosophical text, it is slightly harder reading than the previous mentioned books. Also, with it being written in 1779, the language can come across as a little bit odd or old-fashioned. But don't let that put you off. I really enjoy Hume's writing style and his sense of humor. It also isn't that heavy of a read considering it's a philosophical text. The book is very accessible and there is a mountain of supporting literature for any points you might need a little help with. If you read and enjoy this one, then I would also highly recommend reading An Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding. There is lots of great stuff in there, including ideas that help shape the future of science. Okay, so I'm cheating a little bit here. This one isn't a book, it's a paper. It's a pretty short read, with it only being about 18 pages. The paper is written by Antony Flew, and it was originally released in 1972. The topic of the paper is everyone's favorite subject, the definition of atheism. Flew argues in this paper that atheism should be thought of in the weak or negative sense, arguing that atheism should not be seen in the strong sense, the sense of believing that God does not exist, but instead in the weak sense, the sense of simple non-belief. There are arguments included in the paper for how this stance differs from agnosticism, why it should be seen as simple non-belief, and discussion how best to go about confronting arguments from believers. Some of the arguments we see from many of those who adopt the negative weak atheist stance today can be found in Flew's paper, including its linking to the presumption of innocence, though this paper may help those wanting to promote lack of belief atheism argue their case a little bit stronger. While the argument did not really gain any traction in philosophy and atheism continues to be seen in a strong sense, it's not the case for atheists on the ground. There are many who argue for atheism as simple non-belief and promote atheism in the sense of simple non-belief. Me personally, I prefer the hard atheism stance and do not find Flew's arguments particularly convincing. However, there is no real right or wrong way to define atheism except contextually. For those interested in arguing for or promoting simple non-belief as atheism though, this paper will no doubt be of interest and of use. Even for people like me, the strong atheist, this paper should have some interest. So this one is another paper too, and it comes from C.M. Lurkowski, a philosopher and promoter of atheism. The paper focuses on philosophical atheism, more commonly known as strong atheism. In the paper, Lurkowski also discusses the burden of proof, what it is, why the theist has it, and attempts they make at shifting that burden. There is quite a lot to digest in this paper, but it's also reasonably short, coming in at around 15 pages. Lurkowski also argues for why he believes atheism should be seen in the strong sense. While it is a philosophical work, it's still very accessible and easily understandable by someone without any philosophical training or knowledge. Of course, if you believe atheism is only defined as a lack of belief in God, or should only be defined that way, then this paper may cause you to get a little bit hot under the collar. However, I offer it here as a companion to and in contrast to Flew's paper, The Presumption of Atheism. And we're back to books after that brief intermission. This book comes to us from J.L. Schellenberg and discusses one of the popular arguments for atheism today, divine hiddenness. There are many that consider this to be one of the strongest arguments for atheism, and the YouTube channel Real Atheology is currently doing a series discussing the argument and discussing various objections to the argument. The divine hiddenness argument is a reasonably simple one. It's based on the idea that God is a loving God and desires a personal relationship with all of his creations. However, there are many people who are not resistant to the idea of a relationship with God, but who find themselves without religious experience or a relationship with God. Based on this, we therefore have good reason to believe God does not exist. Now, I know that's a very simplified version of Schellenberg's argument, but this is a book recommendation video and not a deep dive into the divine hiddenness argument, so I'm trying to keep it brief. Definitely worth reading this book. Go out and check it out. There have been plenty of books written arguing for atheism and arguing against theism. Some are bad, some are good, and a few are great. This is one of the great. It is a little harder reading than the other books on this list, though. The Miracle of Theism is written for an analytic philosophy audience, and assumes that anyone reading it will have at least some grounding in philosophy and at least some grasp of the basics. But don't let this put you off, as I think it's useful for anyone wanting to argue for atheism and against theism. The writing is also very accessible for non-philosophy people too, considering the topic and who it's aimed at. Reading it might take a little bit extra work, and you may find yourself having to look up some ideas while reading it, but it is worth that. The author of the book, J.L. Mackie, gives a very in-depth treatment of arguments against theism, always ensuring to give the arguments for theism their strongest reading and going after the strongest of those arguments. He covers popular ideas like the problem of evil, cosmological arguments, moral arguments, design, consciousness, and just so much more, all with great clarity and with great persuasive force. If you want to understand the arguments for atheism or theism, and see just how many there are and how persuasive they can be, then this is definitely a book to read. Even more so if you want to do more than just play the burden of proof game, and want to start arguing against the existence of God. Okay, so this book is a little on the pricey side, but it is a fantastic resource for those wanting to go a little more in-depth into atheism. As you can probably tell from the title, it's a compendium. There are several authors involved and several topics included in the book. From the history of atheism and atheists, to looking at critiques of atheism, to critiques of theist arguments, to ethics, to popular arguments for atheism, and so much more. There really is something for everyone in this book. Its authors include William Lane Craig, Daniel Dennett, and Quentin Smith, among others, showing that the treatments inside the covers are from some of the best in the theism and atheism debate. Some of my past articles even used this as a source, and it was a wealth of information regarding the history of atheism. Definitely one to check out if you want to understand the history of atheism or want to understand atheism in a more in-depth way. The arguments in the book are also very helpful for anyone wanting to up their game when it comes to debating against theism, or wanting to make a positive case for strong atheism. They would even be useful for those wanting to argue for weak atheism, because the arguments can be used as a skeptical defense. Okay, so they were 10 books I would recommend to anyone wanting to look into atheism and agnosticism in a deeper way, including history, arguments for atheism, how atheism is defined, and the experiences of various atheists. However, there's a few more books I'd like to recommend if you want to improve your skepticism and critical thinking. During my undergrad, there were a few books on the reading list that had a big impact on me. Books that not only made me think differently, but revolutionized the way I thought. This book from Daniel Kahneman was one of them. To show just how important this book is, it was required reading for both my philosophy and my psychology. The book is an in-depth discussion focused on the way our brains and minds work, explaining how we humans have two different modes of thought, which Kahneman labels as System 1 and System 2 thinking. System 1 is a fast, intuitive kind of thinking, often driven by emotion, whereas System 2 thinking is a slower and more deliberate kind of thought, usually based more in logic. He spends the book explaining how these two types of thinking compete and impact the way we reason and reach conclusions, as well as being a wealth of information about cognitive biases, common errors in thinking, how evolution has impacted the way we think, and about rationality in general. Like I said, reading the book revolutionized the way I thought about how I think, as well as making me see the rationality, conclusions, and thought processes of others in a completely different way. Determinism and free will are hot-button topics these days, especially since Robert Sapolsky began his tour promoting his book Determined. This isn't a book on determinism as such, but it does have similar ideas. The book from Peter L. Berger and Thomas Luckman discusses social constructionism and how our ideas about many things are social construction, talking about how we come to understand the world through the creation of concepts and how our perceptions are often governed by the societies we grew up in, their history, and more. If you want to understand determinism a little better, then this really is a good introductory book that will help you see all the elements that go into determining who we are, why we do the things we do, and why we see the world the way we do. An advanced warning though, this may make you look at religious people and religion in a very different way. Like Thinking Fast and Slow, this book too revolutionized the way I think. There is much noise made about logic among atheists online, from arguing that it should be promoted, to arguing that theists have none, to playing fallacy bingo with arguments. However, one thing I've noticed is that there is very little actual learning of logic or teaching of logic. Many of the ideas that are promoted about logic in atheist circles are simply false and based on misunderstandings of classical logic. And that includes ideas promoted by some of the bigger names in online atheism. So this is another book I'd like to recommend to those wanting to be better critical thinkers. It's an excellent introduction to classical logic. It goes through logic in nice simple steps, explaining with excellent detail in each step, explaining various argument forms, what valid and sound arguments are, how inferences work, the difference between formal and informal fallacies, and all with exercises to help you understand the topic that bit better, as well as improving your own grasp and use of logic. There is definitely much to learn from this introductory text by Li Shu Fan. Philosophy has a bad rep these days, especially among contemporary atheists. It's all about the science these days. However, as you can probably guess from the fact that I have a couple of philosophy degrees, I think philosophy is interesting. I also think that there is much in it that is useful for the average skeptic, including lots of literature about skepticism. Think, by Simon Blackburn, is a fantastic little book aimed at introducing the basics of a wide variety of topics within philosophy, from ethics to skeptics to religion to epistemology and beyond. I like to describe this book as the Cliff Notes to the first year of my philosophy undergrad, and it was actually recommended as a supporting text for my undergrad degree. Even if you think philosophy is useless, I think you should check this book out. There will be something in there that captures your interest, even if it's just so you can argue that it's wrong. And I also think it has great stuff in there to help improve critical thinking. And there we have it. 10 book recommendations on atheism, and some bonus material to help improve your skepticism and critical thinking. Like I mentioned, a few of those books completely changed the way I think and look at the world. A couple of them I've read a few times just because there is so much to learn from them. Like I also said, the book recommendations for atheism are for those that want to learn more about atheism. When it comes to atheism, there is a rich history of arguments and a lot of interesting characters. And these go all the way back to the Greeks. There is also thought in other cultures too that is well worth hunting down and learning about. They aren't really my area, but I may try doing some stuff on them in the future. It will be a learning experience for me and for you too, hopefully. If there's any other lists of recommendations you want me to tackle, then feel free to drop me a comment and I'll be happy to try to put one together. Or if there's a book you feel should have been on the list or that other atheists should read, then drop a comment about it, naming the book and the information in it, as well as a couple of your thoughts on it. For now though, I'll see you soon. Until then, I hope life treats you well. Take care. Bye.